Hey everybody, a very Merry Christmas to you. Welcome back to the Fish Tank. It's Minion Masters Meta review time. I'm glad you're here. We're going to be looking at, as always, the Minion Masters Meta from the leaderboard data that we've managed to get hold of. Now, we've been scraping that all season, and we're going to dig into it and see what's good and what's maybe not quite so good. If you're new here, make sure you hit that subscribe button. I'm Bad as a Fish, and this is Minion Masters Meta. Right, let's have a look. First thing we're going to look at is Master Popularity. So, this is overall Master Popularity of the leaderboard decks. So we can see there's a bar for each of them. Yellow is the 1v1 portion, red, randoms, and blue, pre-mades. And something that we probably couldn't see coming from a long, sort of 6 months ago or so, is Wrecked is the #1 Master of Choice. Now, we do have to remember that the stuff we're seeing this season is obviously going to be impacted by the balance changes that we've had this season as well. One of which, or two of which, were some of the strongest masters were nerfed. So we saw a nerf to Volko and to Valorian. So I assume that a lot of those players have potentially switched over to Wrecked. So, as we can see here, Wrecked #1 overall, second Ratbo, third looks like it's Morelia. Wrecked has had the biggest increase. Morelia has also had a big uptick, as has Milloween. Ratbo's dropped off the most. There was a bug fix nerf where there's a cooldown now on his squeak attack. Volko also dropped off a lot. As we said, there was a nerf to the ult perk 3, and Valorian also dropping off a decent amount. As we mentioned, a nerf to his ult perk 2, the Fervent Warrior. Right, so let's take this data and put it into a form where it's easy to compare to last season. So we've got our two graphs, and this will be a recurring theme. So on the left, that's last season 2.9, and on the right, this season 2.10. So we can see last season, overall, Ratbo, Wrecked, Valorian, Stormbringer. Now it's Wrecked, Ratbo, Morelia, Stormbringer. So this is overall popularity in all of the ranked modes. So we can see that Wrecked has gone up the most, as we mentioned before. Morelia as well, coming up quite a lot. Now number 3 was number 8 or something. Right, so that's overall, but let's break it down into the different game modes. So this is solos. Again, last season, this season, average mana cost about the same. If you're new to the game, keep your mana cost between sort of 3 and 4.5 as an average. Don't get too far outside of those. Right, so last season, Wrecked was the 1v1 Master of Choice, Valorian and Volko. Now, you might wonder, why, if Wrecked was the Master of Choice last season, why did Valorian and Volko get nerfs? Well, from the data that the devs gave us as part of the balancing, we could see that there were very high win rates for Valorian and Volko when using their specific ult perks. So that's why they got addressed. Wrecked is, I think Wrecked is going to get nerfed in the next season. Was kind of, we could see it coming, but it's going to be happening. His Gun Carter perk 1, that's going to be getting a nerf. That's where he gets the shield, and I think his shield's going to be reduced. Right. So Wrecked, Valorian, and Ratbo, the top 3. Biggest increases in solos this season was for Apep, Ravager. Ravager got a buff in the form of his ult perk 1, I think it was. A huge drop off for Volko. Setsu dropping off as well, not really sure why. And as mentioned about the Wrecked ult perk 1, so that's the Gun Carter versus the Shadow Dance. His win rate for the standard perk 1 was 48%. His win rate for his Gun Carter perk was 62%. So a lot of the strength is there in the Gun Carter ult perk, and that's why it's going to get nerfed. And again, we're talking about Valorian. Valorian still has a much higher win rate when we're looking at his Fervent Warrior, 61% compared to his Holy Light, 50%. So give you an idea of which perks you should be choosing there. Right, so Wrecked, Master of Choice in solos, but what happens if we break it down into randoms? So again, mana cost around 4. Last season, Ratbo, Mordar, Morelia. This season, Mordar is from the leaderboard, the Master of Choice in randoms. It's seen a big increase. But I think from looking at the data, most of it is using the normal perk. His alt perk, the Tomb of the Deathless, can be very strong. But I don't think overall it seems to get the value. It's sort of a perk that's very, very, very strong if you get deep into the late game. But up until that point, it doesn't really seem to do too much. And it's, of course, somewhat dependent on what your opponent is playing. So Mordar's gone up a decent amount, and Ratbo has dropped off a lot. And as mentioned, Ratbo did get that bug fix nerf. So Mordar, Morelia, Ratbo, top 3. Wrecked, 6 months ago, Wrecked would barely be seen in a 2v2 match, but now we're seeing a decent amount of Wrecked. Remember, he does have that alt perk 3, the Mass Illusion, which can be decently strong. Right, so that's randoms. Now let's have a look at premates. So again, premates last season, Stormbringer. This season, Stormbringer. Stormbringer's dropped a little bit, but he's still the Master of Choice. But Wrecked now, the second Master of Choice. Look at that. Last season, the red, Wrecked 3%. This season, Wrecked 13.8%. Wrecked has gone up massively from almost nothing to second overall. So we've seen increases for Wrecked, also somewhat of an increase for Milloween and Diona. But of course, something goes up means something has to go down, and Wrecked has seemingly replaced a lot of Ratbo. Tronvir's dropped off as well, Volko and Valorian with those nerfs, as we mentioned earlier. Let's have a look at the alt perks for a couple here. Let's talk about Wrecked. So we spoke about how strong his Gun Carder perk was in solos. In 2v2 overall, so that's randoms and premates, his Gun Carder had a 55% win rate versus a 48% win rate for his standard perk. And his One Punch Blast, his standard perk 3, had a 52% win rate compared to Mass Illusion's 54% win rate. So if you want to min-max that, you're probably looking at Gun Carder and Mass Illusions in 2v2. Right, so to close out the master section, we're going to look at the draft. Of course, it's not quite the same as the rest of the ranked, because you can't just construct the deck you want. You're making your deck from random choices, but we can see Valorian was the Master of Choice last season, and is the Master of Choice even more this season in draft. 23%, nearly a quarter of leaderboard decks were Valorian. So Stormbringer and Valorian, Apep, Ratbo have all gone up a lot. Morelia and Diona, Volko have dropped off a lot. So if you're wondering which masters to choose in draft, this should give you a great idea. So Valorian, Tronvir, and Morelia, the top 3. Right, rarity composition. If you're new to Minion Masters, the cards are common, rare, supreme, or legendary. Doesn't necessarily mean the strength of the card reflects their rarity, it's more of the complexity. But nothing really changes here, but it's also always worth mentioning, especially for newer players. You don't need a deck full of legendary cards, sorry. You can see here that most of the cards are common or rare. Just to clarify, the top row of this season, the bottom row last season. I didn't mention it earlier, probably should have, but we'll be going through a lot of data. If we skip over it quickly, just pause the video, screenshot, whatever you need to do. Right. Factions in Milloween. I read Milloween, my brain just... Factions in Minion Masters, right. Voidborn are still the faction of choice. Zenshi, number 2. And Slither, number 3. Voidborn's always very popular, and it's gone up even more so this season. Slight increases for Slither and Zenshi, but Empyrean and Stoutheart and Scrat dropping off. Scrat's probably likely to see on the back of Ratbo dropping off a little bit, so Scrats tend to drop off with him. And if you want a little bit more data, you can see here the faction composition broken down into the different modes. You can see solos is very Voidborn dominated. Right, wildcards. What are wildcards? They're duplicates. And silly little graph here, but it always reminds us, no wildcards in solos, no wildcards in premades, and only wildcards in randoms. We can see from the green that's no wildcards, less people not wildcarding. The orange is 1 wildcard and the red is 2, so more wildcards overall. But what are people wildcarding? I'm glad you asked. Let's have a look. Okay, so we'll see this kind of format as we go through. So just to tell you how this sort of the legend, the key works here. So color code. If it's green, it means the rank has increased from last time. Red, decreased. If it's white, it's a new card, which we probably won't have anymore, but it's historically it's in there. And black means it's the same rank. Each card has two numbers. The top left number is its current rank. The top right number is its previous rank. So overall top wildcarded card, Skeleton Crew. Was last season, is this season. So we can see Skeleton Crew. Future Past has gone up a lot. 22nd for last season, 2nd this season. Cleaver, still there or thereabouts. Berserker dropping off from 2nd to 5th. That did get that fear range nerf in the last patch. So we saw Future Past there. That's gone up the most overall. 2nd with Doom Cleaver, Unholy Ground, Stormy. We're seeing a lot more Stormy out there. And as mentioned, Berserker dropping off. Simulacrum dropping off, Slitherbound dropping off, and Razor Squadron dropping off. So those are the top wildcarded cards overall. But let's have a look at the top cards. If you're new to the game and you're thinking about what cards shall I be playing, what cards shall I be crafting, this will give you a really good idea. So these are the top played cards in all leaderboard modes. So again, Tantrum Throwers last season first, this season first. And we can see here, harking back to what we said before about decks are not really overall made out of lots of legendaries. Only 2 of these top 27 cards are legendaries. And interestingly, every single card in the game was seen on the leaderboard at some point this season, which is, I think, is pretty impressive. Right, so Tantrum Throwers, Elite Swarmer, Skeleton Crew, Swarmers, Heal Puff, Slitherbound, lots of cheap cards. Remember, a lot of these cards can be placed directly on a bridge. Tantrum Throwers, Skeleton Crew, Swarmers, Slitherbound, which is really important for grabbing bridges. Now, Morgrul, the Swarmer King, seen a lot of him this season. 7th overall, up from 58th last season. He's had the biggest play rate increase. Frost Feathers, I don't think they're in the top 27, but they have seen the 2nd biggest increase. Remember, they did get a buff, and they're probably going to get a nerf off the back of that. Chain Lightning going up overall, as well as Tranquil She-Howl. But what's gone up? What's gone down? Daggerfall dropping off the most. Haunting Hugger as well. Legionnaires, they did get a sort of a rebalance in the last patch. Berserker, we spoke about that nerf. Okay, so those are the top cards overall. Let's start breaking it down a little bit into different modes. So these are the top cards non-spells. So generally when we go through, we'll look at spells versus non-spells, because those are the 2 kind of sections when you're building your deck that you want to consider. So solos, randoms, pre-mades, a lot of familiar faces, and you can see from the blacks color that a lot of them have not changed. A lot of cards that were popular are still popular, and that kind of makes sense when things haven't necessarily been nerfed. And you can see things like Tantrum Throwers in all 3. First in solos, first in randoms, and 3rd in pre-mades. And that card's proving pretty difficult to balance because it shares stats with Spear Throwers. It's kind of tricky to do. So we mentioned Swarmer King in solos. That's gone up a lot. Prowler, seeing a lot more Prowler out there. Also, solos has been seeing some more Impatient Statue and Frost Feathers, as we mentioned before. Legionnaires dropping off. Increases in randoms for Lone Wolf and Reconator. And some big decreases in pre-made. Siege Imperator Ruby dropping off. Berserker dropping off, as we've seen kind of across the board. So overall, Tantrum Throwers, Elite Swarmers, Skeleton Crew, Swarmers, and Heal Puff are the top 5 overall. And interestingly, the Tantrum Throwers in first place overall, almost sort of 1.5 times, maybe a little more popular than Elite Swarmers. So Tantrum Throwers overall are first, and they're first by a long way. Right, let's have a look at some spells. So solos, randoms, and pre-made spells, which are your spells of choice. Now, as always, we tend to see bigger removal spells getting more play in the 2v2s as opposed to solos. You can see things like the Beam of Doom, Blade Star as a good example. So Daggerfall, still the #1 spell of choice, but interestingly, also the #1 card that had the biggest reduce in play rate. So it's still first, but not quite so dominant as it was before. Hypnotize, seeing more of that. Chain Lightning, always a very powerful spell. And you can see it's top 3 in all of those different modes. So if you're looking to build a deck and you're wondering what sort of spells to include, depending on the mode you're playing, this will give you a really good idea. Now, new players are always really desperate to get their hands on Legendaries, and as we mentioned a couple of times, Legendaries are not the be-all and end-all. You don't need a deck full of Legendaries, but they're cool to have, right? And especially if you're thinking about crafting them, you want to craft a Legendary that's good and, you know, possibly flexible. So some Legendaries will see that you'll build a specific deck around, whereas others are very, very flexible. For example, Karmic. We see Karmic in all 3 modes there. One of the newer cards to the game, getting a nerf I think in the next patch, but very, very strong, and it's kind of flexible. You can put it in any deck, doesn't need any sort of synergy really, and it's good to go. So Morgul, we spoke before about how we're seeing a lot more Morgul, and Morgul is the Legendary of choice in solos. So overall, Morgul is the most played Legendary, according to our leaderboard data, followed closely by Karmic, not so closely by Reckonator in 3rd place. So if you're looking to add some Legendaries, these are great ones to get. Okay, next up we're going to have a look at the draft. As mentioned before, draft is a little different because you're building your deck from random choices. You don't get to construct it. But with enough data, some interesting stuff can be gleaned from it. So these are the top cards, non-spells. So, you know, maybe take a screenshot of this, and if you're building your draft and you see any of these cards, then they might be, they're going to be a great inclusion, depending on what else you have in your deck, of course. So Spear Throwers, #1, gone up from 44. Prop Scrats, #2, up from 40. So a lot of things, unlike the solo metas, sometimes the sort of the draft metas change a lot, just, you know, because of the random nature of it. So those are our top 27. One thing I find interesting to look at is to compare which cards are played heavily in ranked mode. We'll talk about ranked solos compared to draft. And which cards are which cards are played heavily in ranked but not so heavily in draft, and vice versa. So for example, cards with a much higher play rate in draft than ladder, Sniper Scrat, we can see they're in 9th place. Very, very rarely played in ladder, but very heavily played in draft. Same with Crossbow Clubhouse, Fergus, and Drone Walker. And of course, the other way round, which cards are played higher on ladder, but very rarely seen in draft? Impatient Statue, Gax, Gorex Gate, Wheel of Doom, and Boomer were the top ones. Right, so those are our top non-spells for draft. And these are the top spells for draft. So Scrotillery, not a card we see on ladder too much, but overall a great choice in draft. It's some face damage, it's some AoE damage, it's bridge grab potential, and it's the #1 choice, and it's gone up the most. So again, if you're building your draft deck and you've got this to hand, any of these options given to you, then they might be good choices. Of course, we've got some very different ones here. Damage spells, summon spells, all sorts of different things. Okay, so we looked at the Masters, we looked at the cards. Let's put them together and look at the decks. So the way that we kind of figure out which is the top deck is we look at, I've obviously got a huge spreadsheet of all this data. We look at the decks based on, firstly, their position on the leaderboard, and secondly, on the rank of the cards that are in it. So these are decks that are highly placed on the leaderboard and have basically the best cards in them. There's one for each master, and the order of the masters is the order that we find them in there. So we can see the top deck we've found here is Wrecked. And interestingly, this is a Bridge Shrine deck. So this is all about getting that Bridge Shrine, getting the double bonus from holding a bridge that it's close to, and just denying the rest of it. So the interesting thing about Bridge Shrine is it kind of almost makes the game have 3 bridges, right? because you've got your bridge with the shrine that basically counts for 2 bridges, and then you've got the other bridge. So if you can just hold your bridge with the bridge shrine, that's all you really need to do. You're going to end up winning by Mana Frenzy. So that's the kind of thing that's how that works out. Valorian doing a very similar thing there. Diona, we've got a future present in there. Rockin' Roller is a big heavy removal, and the rest is just cheap cycle. King Puff, and a Ratbo deck there. Next up we have Shruma Mashumi Splitting Volco deck. A Voidborn based Ravager deck. Stormbringer again with the Bridge Shrine in there. And that's quite a nice sort of addition to a Stormbringer deck, because often with Stormbringer decks you're putting a lot, well, not necessarily Stormbringer decks, but the Spawnbringer decks, you're putting a lot of pressure on bridges. And if you're keeping those bridges, why not get double the value from it? Right, next up we have a somewhat interesting Morelia. Heavy end. Milloween, Dragon's Nest. I think that was the deck that I was playing. And then we have a future present Apep. No future past, but just the future present. And a lot of cheap stuff in there. One thing we can't see from this data, unfortunately, is we can't see which alt perks the Masters are using. Okay, and then we see Tromvir, Mordar, and coming up the rear, Setsu with a Void Altar aggro deck. Right, next up we have decks for randoms. So, as we mentioned before, we'll see a lot more cards with AoE removal, whether they're minions, whether they're spells. So, Shield God of Light, Reckonator, we see a lot of those in there. Blade Star. So, Ratbo was the #1 choice. Then we've got King Puff coming up in 2nd place. I think that's my King Puff deck. Then we have Wrecked, Volco. Then we've got a future Apep deck at the bottom there. Milloween, Morelia, Stormbringer. Mountain Shaper seeing some a lot more play than it used to. Remember in randoms, if you have the little look at the little tab above some of the cards, that means that they are wild-carded. What do we have here? Mordar. Then we've got a aggro Diona deck. And then closing out this section, Valorian, Tronvir with Cringe, Triple, Morgul, the Swarmer King, Ravager, and again coming up the rear, Setsu. And then finally in the deck section, we're going to look at the pre-mades. One thing to remember with the pre-mades is these decks may be specifically designed to work with an accompanying deck. Maybe they don't. Some people just specifically play with one other person and they build their decks together. Some people just have a nice deck and they play with all sorts of different people. Right, so we see here we've got Ratbo as the first one. Ravager, interestingly, here in 2nd place. Milloween, likely to be using that Milloween's alt perk 2, the Zanian Spellbook. That's very, very powerful. Some copycat decks here from Tromvir and Wrecked. Maybe the same person just trying different masters. Morelia, Valorian, Apep. A lot of similar cards here. Setsu, not last place in pre-mades. Interestingly, this is a very aggro Setsu deck. With not a huge amount of spells in it. Diona, Bats, and Lord Fanriel, the Storm Charger. We've seen that a lot. And then here we see King Puff, Mordar, Stormbringer, and a Volco deck. Right. So that's kind of all the stuff we're going to go over in detail. What we're going to do next is we're just going to go through some slides quickly. It's going to be too quick for you to really pay attention to during the video, but if you want to pause it and go back, you can do. This reminds me of, and I'm going to make myself sound very old here, but back in the day, I used to watch a game, if you're British, sorry, a show, if you're British, on TV here called Games Master, which was a video games based TV show, and they had a section at the end. The idea was to record the show on VHS, and then they had a section at the end that just went through stuff real fast, and you would play it back in slow motion, and you'd see all the secret stuff, and it was super cool. So we're basically going to do the same thing here. So get ready. Okay, so overall top cards. So we're going to have a look at solo stuff. And then the same for randoms. And of course the same for pre-mades. And then we're going to have a quick look at the top cards per mode, per master. So if you're looking for a specific master, this should be great for you. So APEP. Diona. King Puff. Milloween. Mordor. Morelia. Wrecked. Radbo. Ravager. Setsu. Dawnbringer. Tronvir. Valorian. And Volko. There we have it. Guys, thanks so much for joining me for this Minion Masters 2.1 meta overview. Hopefully it was useful. This should be useful for players whether you're new or an existing player. If you're enjoying the content here, make sure you hit that subscribe button. Give this video a thumbs up if you liked it. Let me know in the comments, what do you have on your mind? And that's pretty much all I wanted to cover. Happy holidays, of course. My name's Bad as a Fish, and I'll see you again soon here in the fish tank.